Well, welcome back, folks, to a special presentation of History with Tony. Today, we're going to celebrate the life of Nelson Mandela. I'm sure a lot of you probably don't know a lot about Nelson Mandela. I know, I'll be honest, I didn't. So let's get started. And I think probably a good way to get started would be listening to just a little bit of music that Mandela probably would have heard as a youth in his small village in South Africa. Okay, well, what about Nelson Mandela? Well, folks, there have been few individuals that have born in this world that had such a significant influence upon others that like Nelson Mandela. And nobody would have expected it, I'll be honest. His circumstances of his birth were primitive at best. He was born in 1918 in a very remote village in South Africa. And he was given a name which meant troublemaker in his native Xhosa dialect, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. His great-grandfather was the king of the Thembu Kingdom, which would become South Africa's modern-day Eastern Cape province. However, even by the standards of which his royalty, it was really an impoverished upbringing by Western standards. Barely knew his father. His father had several wives. When he was 9, his father died, and his mother no longer could care for him like she wanted to. So she took him to the Thembu region, since he was kind of in the royal line, and asked the chief to take him and raise him. And the chief said, of course. And his new mother, was a very devout Christian. And she sensed early on Mandela's very natural intellect. And so she decided to enroll him in a Methodist high school. And, that way he could receive a Christian education, a Western style education. And, that would really help in his life later. He was first family to ever attend a formal school. And from there, he progressed into a Methodist college, where he became interested in the African culture. And even though he was immersed deeply in the Western culture, the roots for his eventual rise to the presidency of South Africa lay in this college, in this Western-style education. But really, folks, to understand Nelson Mandela, we have to understand the environment in which he was born into, because it was not like the environment that he eventually became president of. So let's go back a little bit and look at South Africa as it was when Nelson Mandela was born. By the way, this is a photograph of his birthplace. That would have been a replica of the hut that he was born in. This is Nelson Mandela as a young college student, what he would have looked like. So let's look at a really brief history of South Africa itself. Mandela was born into a land that was divided by several different factions. There was Eastern colonial rulers, there were the tribal factions, and then there was the descendants of the original white settlers, which became known as Afrikaners. Now, the first Europeans to settle the southern tip of Africa were the Portuguese. They were looking for a place to settle and go around the Cape of Good Hope. But they were soon replaced by the Dutch. The Portuguese weren't there for very long. And by the 1600s, the Dutch had pretty well taken over the coastline of South Africa, because they were looking for sea routes to India to increase their trade, which was huge. That lasted for about 200 years until the Napoleonic Wars, and they were unfortunately on the losing end of the Napoleonic Wars. And so all their areas that they had settled in the empire out in the parts of the world were taken over by the British. And so by the early 1800s, the British had taken over control of the tip of South Africa. Now, as you might imagine, the Dutch and the Portuguese settlers that were there didn't like that. So they decided to move inward into Africa. in what became known as the Great Trek. And from there, they established three separate countries called Boer republics of Natal, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal in the eastern part of South Africa. I'll show you a map in a moment. They'll make you understand that. The English and the Boers coexisted pretty much for several years until diamonds and gold were found around Johannesburg in the Transvaal. Well, that changed everything. All of a sudden, the English wanted those lands. And so, led by Cecil Rhodes, who was the founder and the benefactor of the Rhodes scholarships that we hear so often of, began a campaign to annex these Boer states into the British Empire. The result was there was actually two Boer Wars, an early one, but the biggest one was 1899 and 1902. And that resulted in a British victory and the creation of what became known as the Union of South Africa in 1910. Now, caught up in all this was the native Africans. They made up 80% of the population. I may have given you the impression so far that this was a white, area. They only represented a very small minority of the population, but obviously they were in control. Now, some of these native populations resisted. The Zulu tribe, they fought a series of wars called the Zulu Wars in the 1800s, as did the Xhosa tribe, the tribe of Nelson Mandela. They had fought several wars against both the English and the Boers, but they were incapable of winning, and they were overwhelmed. And eventually they was forced into what the English called preserves or homelands, which comprised only about 10% of the land. So that was the environment that Nelson Mandela was born into. He was born into this country that had just become part of the Union of South Africa in 1910. He was in a homeland that was a very compressed area that contained the native population. Now, there had always been segregation in South Africa ever since the Dutch had settled, but it started becoming much more rigid in 1934. Nelson Mandela would have been about 16 in 1934. By 1948, it really became rigid. A system called apartheid was developed, which established an absolute total separation of the races. And that's the way South Africa was ruled until 1994, when Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa. So here's this first map. Will show you what South Africa would have looked like before the Boer Wars. The green part here was Cape Colony. That was the British-ruled area. And then you had these three states up here called the Boer Republics. You had the Orange Free State. You had the Transvaal, where Johannesburg and Pretoria were located. You had the Natal region, where Durban on the coast is located. Nelson Mandela was born down here in Cape Colony, in an area right through here. Now, this is what South Africa looks like today. It's divided up into provinces, like we would call states. You have the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, the Eastern Cape, which is where Mandela was born. You have the Free State, which basically is the old Orange Free State. You have the Transvaal, which was kind of subdivided into four regions: Northwest Province, Limpopo, this one here, and then this small area here around Johannesburg. And of course, the Natal area is Natal. Lesotho is an independent country, as is Swaziland over here. So this is what South Africa looks like today. This is what it looked like in the early or late 1900s. So that's the environment that Nelson Mandela was born into. Born into an environment that had just been taken over by the British, born into an environment where the races were separated and became even more separated. So how did Nelson Mandela progress into this leader of South Africa? Well, when he went to college, he was given an anglicized name. He began to be known as Nelson. Some people speculate he was born named after Lord Nelson because the school he went to was deeply immersed into the British culture. He took up ballroom dancing. He was in drama productions. He was a Christian. He taught Bible classes. While he was interested in politics, he really didn't get too much involved with it in the beginning. There was a new movement being brought up at this time called the African National Congress, the ANC, which wanted South Africa to be separated from the British Empire and ruled by the majority Black population. But he really didn't get too much involved in this in the beginning. He was kind of immersing himself into the British culture at this time. By 1940, he made his way to Johannesburg, and eventually he began studying law at the University of Witwatersrand. And this is where he became a little bit more involved in politics. For one reason, he was the only Black African student in this university. That's how intelligent he was. And it was here that he began to realize that there was a lot of racism going on. Up to this point, he'd kind of been immune to all that, apparently. He became increasingly politicized and eventually joined the ANC, which he kind of, not been involved in early. Over the next few years, his political philosophy would be greatly influenced by the national movement, which was dedicated in creating this independent country ruled by native Blacks. Well, in 1948, elections were held, and they were not free elections by any means, and the White Afrikaner Party gained control. And they openly began to codify and expand the racial segregation that had already existed, but now it became even worse. And they developed this new apartheid legislation. That's when Mandela definitely became radicalized. He absolutely understood at that point how separate the races were. And he began to work within the radical factions of the ANC, which were, I'll be honest, were communist inspired. He eventually became one of the best known political figures in South Africa, even as a young man. Well, with this recognition brought him attention from the ruling Afrikaner Party. In 1952, he was first arrested under the Suppression of Communist Act, and he was convicted. And while he avoided prison, he was able to be probated. He was banned from associating with the ANC. But as you might imagine, that didn't work. And his influence just continued to grow. He started a law practice in Johannesburg dedicated to representing Black people who were in turn fighting the apartheid rule. And this only brought him even more renewed attention from the Afrikaner Party. By 1956, he was arrested again, along with most of the ANC leadership, charged with high treason. That's a really serious act. In most states, treason is punishable by death. Eventually, after a very long trial, he was found not guilty, but he nevertheless spent 5 months in a very serious prison in Pretoria. So this was the conditions that existed then in the 50s when Mandela began to be very radicalized. You can see here, this is a picture of one of the homelands, very impoverished, very crude, little violence, corruption. This is one of the signs that would have, existed. These public premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white people. I mean, they were totally separated. You could not go from one place to the next without a pass. You had to have a pass dispensed by the Afrikaner government to be able to move from one place to the other. And there were certain places you could not be in. It was a totally segregated country at that point. Well, by 1959, the ANC had become very, very radicalized. And they decided they were going to start a protest of this situation where you could not travel unless you had a pass. For the most part, it was waged with civil disobedience. They would do things which would blockade and all, but they weren't really violent. That all changed when there was a massacre in a little town called Sharpeville, which became known as the Sharpeville Massacre. And it brought immediate attention to the Afrikaner government. And one reason, because 69 protesters were killed. That was the incident that put Mandela over the edge. He knew at that point that only an armed revolution would bring about native rule. He was inspired by Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution that occurred about the same year. And he began working with an armed group within the ANC. Its name was the Spear of the Nation, whose goal was to end apartheid rule of South Africa through revolution. And he began to travel around the country and disguised as a chauffeur because, again, you had to have passes to travel, and it was very difficult to go from one area to the other. But he was a chauffeur, and so he could do this. And he began to travel around the country and meeting with groups of people representing the ANC, the Spear of the Nation, advocating sabotage of important infrastructures within the country. So he became a full-fledged revolutionary. Unfortunately for him, that didn't last long. In 1960, I believe it was, he had traveled out of the country looking for foreign support. And he had stopped in Ethiopia to get some training in guerrilla warfare. I mean, he was totally radicalized at this point. And when he got back to South Africa, he was arrested. A lot of people suspect that the United States and the CIA had something to do with identifying where he was and notifying the South African government. After a very high-profile trial in which he admitted to sabotage, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. A highlight of his trial was his opening defense speech, where he gave what became known as the "I am prepared to die" speech. And this speech was copied and published and sent all over the world. And it really brought attention to Mandela as well as the apartheid conditions. That was, there was all sorts of calls for his release, but that wasn't going to happen. And he would spend the next 27 years in prison, 27 years. The first 18 years were spent on a place called Robben Island in an 8x7 concrete cell with only a straw mat to sleep on. Folks, it was a horrible situation. He was verbally, physically harassed. His body was broken, but not his spirit. He had to spend his days working rocks into the gravel. And his nights he spent working on a law degree through a correspondence course. I'm surprised that they would let him do that, but they did, And so that was what happened on the first 18 years. This is the speech, part of the speech that he gave at his trial, and which put him in prison for life in prison. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination, and I fought against black domination. I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. He was prepared to die for what he believed in. Well, 1970s, he continued his life in prison, but it began to improve a little bit. The picture up here at the top is Robben Island, where he spent the first 18 years. He was began to be a little bit more free during the prison time because there was an overturn in the leadership of the Afrikaner government, which began to realize that what they were doing wasn't working. So he began to work with some of the apartheid activists, like Desmond Tutu. He began secretly writing his autobiography, which would later be smuggled out of the prison, published in the UK. But things got worse in South Africa in the 1980s. A lot of the violence. I mean, it became an open war in South Africa. By 1988, Nelson Mandela had turned 70 and was ill with a lot of ailments, tuberculosis amongst them. And the Afrikaner government thought, hey, we got to let this guy go because he was becoming more and more of a symbol to the party of the ANC. So they offered him freedom. They said, hey, we'll let you go on these conditions. You got to renounce violence. You got to break with the Communist Party. and you got to not insist on majority rule by the black population. And he said, I'm not doing that. He could have been released, but he said, I'm not going to renounce what I believe in. So he stayed in prison for another several years. He was transferred to a better prison near Johannesburg, where he got better medical care and he wasn't forced to do all this hard labor. Remember, he's in his 70s at this point. In 1989, there was an election, and the Afrikaner Party had realized that things were going to have to change. There was so much violence going on that they realized that the apartheid system they had put in place was just unsustainable. And so a new leader took over. His name was de Klerk. And he took the very brave step of releasing Mandela without conditions. And this is a photograph of Nelson Mandela with his wife and his supporters as he was released from his prison near Johannesburg. So, how did Nelson Mandela become the president of South Africa? Well, he had mellowed. He wasn't the open revolutionary that he used to be. He was still committed to the black majority rule, and he was committed to getting rid of apartheid. And he said, if that's going to take armed revolution, I will support it, but I don't want that. I want apartheid to be abolished through peaceful means. So over the next 4 years, he traveled extensively throughout the world, throughout South Africa, pleading for majority rule in South Africa. And he began to work with de Klerk. De Klerk was not the typical apartheid ruler. Even the fact that these two leaders actually won the Nobel Prize in 1993 because they were openly working together to end apartheid and to have free elections in the country. That's what finally happened in 1994. And as you might expect, the ANC won a huge majority of the votes. Remember, the native population made up probably 80% of the population. So they obviously would have won the election. The first act of the new National Assembly that was created was to elect Mandela as South Africa's first black president. Remember, he's at this point in his late 70s. Over the next few years, Mandela would preside over the transition from apartheid rule to a multicultural democracy. And, it worked out. He and de Klerk were working together. De Klerk was appointed deputy president. The Afrikaners began to understand they had to get rid of apartheid. They began to loosen the rules. And finally, by, 1996, 1997, apartheid had been totally demolished in South Africa. This is a photograph of Mandela and de Klerk as they were working together. Very harmonious situation at this point. So, Nelson Mandela is now the president of South Africa. Now, he was an old man, and he had huge health issues, but he would rule for the next 6 years as president. And during this time, he oversaw the building of the coalition between the ANC and the White Minority Party. He oversaw the formation of something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by then Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to investigate all the crimes that had been occurred under the apartheid rule. He wasn't going to sweep all this under the rug. He was going to bring the leaders of this apartheid to justice, the ones that had done serious crimes. His presidency would see tremendous growth in South Africa. It would work towards alleviating the huge disparity that existed between the wealth and the services between the native population and the Afrikaner population. He targeted housing, he targeted healthcare, education, land reform, all to kind of ease the transition into this democratic country of South Africa. Most importantly, maybe, was South Africa began to see a huge increase in tourism. Up to this point, tourism had practically all but ceased in South Africa. And remember, South Africa is where you have all these game preserves now. And today, people travel from all over the world to these game preserves to see these wild animals that have been protected now. But that had all pretty well ended under apartheid rule. And of course, that brought a great amount of tourism, and it brought a great amount of money into South Africa, which is what the whole purpose of that. Now, that doesn't mean everything was great. Okay. There was still division within the country. And by 1996, the ANC began to place checks on the political and administrative authority within their constitutional democracy, to the point that de Klerk and the white minority party said, hey, this isn't working. We thought we were going to be partners, and it doesn't seem to be that way now. So he withdrew from the coalition. And for the next 28 years, ANC would rule on their own without help from the old Afrikaners and the old white establishment of South Africa. That didn't work either, because if you know anything about South Africa, there was a great amount of violence that took place, corruption, inefficiency of government. And just this past month, they held elections in South Africa again, and the ANC, for the first time, lost the majority vote of the country. And at this point, right now, they're working, trying to build a coalition to rule the government again. And they're working once again with the old Afrikaner white coalition party, trying to rebuild what de Klerk and Mandela had at the beginning of South Africa. Whether it works or not, nobody's going to know for sure. Well, there's a picture of Nelson Mandela at his height, probably in his early 80s, as he was ruling the country. So, what happened to Nelson Mandela at the end? Well, by 1999, Mandela had decided it was time for him to retire. He was in the late 80s. He was very ill. He wanted to just rest. And so he retired. But he found that difficult. People that are in charge, in power, sometimes find it very hard to decompress. And that's what happened to Mandela. And even though he was ill, even though he was elderly, he just could not settle down. So he went back to a semi-active life, and not as the ruler, but as, the kind of symbolic leader of the country. He traveled all over the world. He met with rulers. He put out another biography. He began to focus on rural development, school construction, and particularly HIV and AIDS, which at that point was rampant in Africa. He also became very active in criticizing Western powers. He condemned NATO in 1999 for their intervention in Kosovo. And he was very adamantly against the war in Iraq in 1993. And he really went after both President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair of the UK. Did not help his situation at that point, tried to enlist the help of Western countries. By 2004, Mandela was 85 years old, and he could not physically continue this public life. So he began once again to withdraw from public view. He did make one last trip to the United States in 2005, and it was an attempt to increase support for Africa. He met with Bush, he met with Senators Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and he pleaded for his case, and he had some success. If you know anything about President Bush's administration, he's condemned by a lot of people. But one of the things that he's held up for is his work in combating HIV and AIDS in Africa. He probably, more than any president in the United States, worked towards ending AIDS in Africa. Back home, he continued to support ANC. By 2013, he was 95 years old, and he just could no longer go. December 5th, 2013, he finally succumbed to a myriad of health issues. And later that month, state funeral was held in Pretoria and was attended by representatives from all over the world, 90 countries. As one supporter said, the soul of South Africa has died. So that was the end of this unbelievable life that Nelson Mandela traveled. He went from a primitive native being raised in a hut to the leader of a country, the Nobel Prize winner, to somebody who was a symbol of freedom throughout the world. So I thought maybe the best way to end this was a song that was written about Nelson Mandela. It's called A Beautiful Life. And I thought maybe that's kind of the best way to end this. So here is a song called A Beautiful Life about Nelson Mandela, 1918 to 2013.
You gave us laughter with your smile and your dance. You taught us to believe in hope, peace, and forgiveness. You always knew how to reach into our hearts and bring us together. But did you know that you would give a nation wings to fly? And did you know that you would bring so many dreams to life? And did you know that you would pay so high a price to make freedom come alive with your beautiful life? What a beautiful life. You let the dignity and grace through it all. You saw the dream of the rainbow out of the storm. You never let go. You walked the road ahead to bring us together. But did you know that you would give a nation wings to fly? And did you know that you would bring so many dreams to life? And did you know that you would pay so high a price to make freedom come alive with your beautiful life? What a beautiful life. Oh yeah. You are our hero. You led the way to freedom. You are the one who raised us higher. But did you know that you would give a nation wings to fly? And did you know that you would bring so many dreams to life?